Hello and welcome. I'm Michael Rochman, and that's Bailey Kumar, and we are the 2-Minute Drill podcast. You know the player profiles on this channel. The two of us have probably produced a majority of them, and we hope that you guys like them enough to stick around for some additional draft content that we're going to be posting 4 times a week during the day, hopefully out on YouTube and other platforms. And we're hoping to get a little bit more into the thought process and just our overall thoughts on some of the teams and what they could do during the draft. And the first one that we want to talk about is what the Chargers are going to do at number 5, because a lot of people kind of talk about the draft starting at that 5th pick, and there's a lot of options on the board. Jim Harbaugh, hired as the head coach, going to take over this team and hopefully guide them to that next stage of where they've been expecting to go for a while now with Justin Herbert at quarterback. Bailey, what do you think this Chargers team could potentially do?
Yeah, well, before we talk about 5, I think we're going to talk about the first 4 picks. The runout that we expect is Williams, May, Daniels, and then Harrison Jr. At 5, I think the Chargers can go really in any direction they want to, offense or defense. I have a feeling they're going to lean offense, but they could definitely use a defensive player. On offense, they're probably looking at offensive line or wide receiver, or hey, even a tight end.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at what Jim Harbaugh did at Michigan, I think trenches were a major focus, whether that was offense or defense. And looking at this draft class, obviously, the offensive tackle position is where the prize is of this class. Joel, Olufashanu, Talisa Fuaga. There are a lot of talented prospects here at the top end of this class, and even guys like Amarius Mims, J.C. Latham, and plenty of others that are worth consideration for just listing as one of the top names. So what Jim Harbaugh could potentially do is look to draft a tackle here at number 5. And obviously they have Rashawn Slater, who's probably going to be the left tackle of the future. They even have Trey Pipkins, who is a serviceable right tackle in a league that is kind of underwhelming at right tackle right now. But, if he wants to try to bolster that unit, he could look at a tackle like Alt Fashanu, maybe try to put them at left tackle and Slater at right tackle. Or maybe he goes with a guy like Fuaga and surprises people based on the current consensus ranking and puts him at right tackle. What are your thoughts on this offensive tackle batch here at the top of the class, and what do you think Harbaugh would think about trying to draft one of them and putting them into that lineup?
Yeah, I mean, definitely it's a very talented top of the class. There's a lot of really good players. You can't really go wrong. If I'm Harbaugh, I'm leaning towards Joe Alt as a top pick. He's just so polished and smooth already. You kind of just plug and play him anywhere. I think that they're going to keep Slater at left tackle. Whoever they draft, if they draft an offensive tackle, would probably slide over to that right tackle position. But really, I think they could go any offensive tackle prospect, but lean the more developed guy over the kind of more upside potential which some of these offensive tackles have in the class.
And something that's really interesting with the Chargers is their weapons situation, because obviously they might look into cutting Mike Williams this offseason. Keenan Allen's getting kind of older. They drafted Quentin Johnson in the first round last year. Even though it was the old regime, they probably still have hope for him to contribute to this offense. Josh Palmer has some wide receiver 3 value, I think, in any offense around the league. There is really a crowded wide receiver room. So maybe drafting a guy like Malik Neighbors, who a lot of people view as one of the top wideouts in this class and one of the top players overall, it kind of becomes a very crowded room in that regard. Even if you cut Williams, you're kind of pushing someone out of that rotation. Obviously, they might be okay with it if it's Palmer, but probably not ideal to kind of fill out this wide receiver room when you're Jim Harbaugh and you have such a run game identity for what your offense usually is. Even at San Francisco, he kind of embraced the run game for that offense. So it kind of doesn't make a ton of sense if they were to go Neighbors. Just from an ideological standpoint, the talent is absolutely there. Neighbors is someone that I think is one of the most elite wide receivers in this class. He has wide receiver 1 upside in the NFL and could potentially be a star in the NFL. Where that maybe does make a little bit more sense is taking a guy like Bowers, where Harbaugh obviously has seen what Mark Andrews has done with the Ravens. Greg Roman has obviously been a offensive coordinator for him. So both guys have that experience and knowledge of what a tight end of that kind of skill set and caliber can bring to an offense. Do you think Bowers, despite being a tight end, could potentially be the guy that lands there at number 5 for the Chargers?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Bowers is a great talent at tight end. I know it's not a very popular pick among fans just because how first-round tight ends have ended up in the past, but Bowers has crazy potential. One of the best tight end prospects I've ever seen. And just to take a step back, when you talk about Jim Harbaugh and Greg Roman and what they like to do, they love to run the ball. When you hear them talking in the media interviews, it's all about running the ball. So when you go back and talk about offensive tackles that they could take, that is one surefire way to transform a unit that has been awful. I mean, the Chargers' run game was terrible last year, and when you bring in an offensive tackle, you gave it an instant vitalization. And when you talk about Brock Bowers, he is someone who can also contribute in the run game. A wide receiver like Malik Neighbors is a great downfield threat, but he really isn't going to be helping in that run game situation where Bowers kind of gives you a little bit of both. He can help you in the run game, he can help you in the pass game as well.
Yeah, and we talked about Jim Harbaugh loving to invest in the trenches. Obviously, there are some very talented edge rushers in this class, but they haven't really been talked about in that tier of defender and just overall prospect. You look at guys like Jared Verse, Dallas Turner, maybe even a guy like Leatu Latu, who maybe has the production, but maybe there's questions about his testing and medicals. Do you think someone from this edge class could potentially work up into that number 5 range after testing, or do you think that's something where maybe they are talented enough and maybe they'll be good enough in the NFL, but the prospects ahead of them are just too strong for them to potentially make that jump?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a tough call. This edge class is very talented. I don't know if any of them have the real polish that you want to see out of a top 5 edge guy. And the Chargers, especially when talking about the Chargers at 5, they already kind of have a good edge situation, so I can't really see that. If I'm the Chargers and I want to take defense, I'm taking a cornerback. They signed J.C. Jackson last year, kind of was a disaster, not even on the team anymore. You kind of are looking for that guy to play across Asante Samuel. I think they had one of the, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but I think they were one of the worst pass defenses in the league last year. So if I'm the Chargers and I want to go defense, I'm kind of ignoring edge right now and more looking towards the cornerback class.
Yeah, and this cornerback class is one that's extremely interesting. Quinyon Mitchell is someone that's kind of flying up boards right now. He had a great Senior Bowl, obviously played at Toledo and was shut down during his time there, but he is a MAC prospect, so there is a question of competition that he's faced compared to guys like Kool-Aid McKinstry, Terrion Arnold, and other top prospects in this class. Do you think this is something where cornerback could potentially work into that top 5 range? I mean, obviously, there's other guys like DeJean and Nate Wiggins that are just some of the best corners in this class. Do you think there's someone from that batch who separates themselves and works into that top 5 slot, or do you think that's another position where maybe they'd have to trade down if they were to address the cornerback spot with their first-round pick?
I mean, I think that there are cornerbacks that could climb to the top 5 of this class. I think in previous years, we've kind of seen a change in how the media looks at cornerbacks. There's been a lot of cornerbacks that come draft day are going way, way above their projections. And I wouldn't be surprised to see a cornerback at 5. I couldn't tell you exactly who I expect to see be the pick at 5. I think the combine is going to be very important for cornerbacks, especially separating themselves from this pack where there's a ton of top guys around who's going to be CB1, and you're looking for someone to separate themselves. I can't tell you who it's going to be, but I mean, I definitely could see someone having a killer combine, killing interviews, and the Chargers look at their team and say, hey, I think we like what we got on offense. We can fill some of these holes through free agency. Let's go take a cornerback. Let's fix the defense.
Yeah, I mean, we saw a guy like Witherspoon last year for Seattle wasn't really projected as a top 5 guy.
Yep.
There were people who viewed him that highly to where they thought he was the best cornerback in the class maybe, but around this time last year, he was definitely not expected to be a top 5 pick. Ended up going number 5 to Seattle. So we could definitely see the board kind of shift from what the mock drafts and consensus big boards expect, obviously, but I think this is a class where if you're the Chargers, even if you like Pipkins and you think he's a serviceable right tackle, the options in this tackle class are so good where we've seen, positions of talent be filled through the draft where the need wasn't as immediate as it may have appeared, but there was still a aggression when it came to drafting those guys early in the class because of what the impact and caliber they were going to be. So, if you're the Chargers and you are looking at guys like Joe Alt, Olu Fashanu, Talisa Fuaga, Amarius Mims, J.C. Latham, whoever is your top tackle, and you're saying, look, we get this guy, we're going to, A, be able to dominate on the ground, B, we are going to have both our bookend tackles for the long term, and we are going to feel comfortable protecting our franchise quarterback behind them, and C, you just think they're going to be a long-term, high-end contributor. That is something that is definitely worth the number 5 pick, and even though there may be bigger needs, it's not all about what your biggest need is when you're on the clock. It's about who you think is going to make the biggest impact. And guys like Alt, guys like Fashanu, and guys like Fuaga definitely, I think, can. And I know Fuaga is definitely not being discussed in that caliber with Alt and Fashanu, but I think he's someone that just fits what Harbaugh has consistently done at Michigan, and that is getting big-time run blockers that are great athletes and trying to get them to kind of just elevate the offense as a whole. And, when you look at what he does around the field, he's moving. And I did a 2-minute drill on him yesterday, so you can check that out if you want to. But this is a guy that I think is going to work into that discussion. He's going to have a great combine, and I think he's someone that at number 5, it's definitely going to be a risky pick. It's going to be one that, a lot of people are going to have some heavy opinions on, but you have to take the guy that you value most and you feel best fits your team. And I think Fuaga could easily be that guy for Harbaugh and the Chargers.
Yeah, I mean, another consideration is how often are you going to have top 5 picks with Herbert as your QB? You kind of got lucky, quote-unquote lucky this year with Herbert's injury. You managed to tank to that top 5 spot. Are you happy walking away from an offensive tackle that's probably like you're sticking at right tackle, not a huge need, it is a big need, but it's like not a huge need. Trey Pipkins, as you say, is kind of serviceable. It's not that great value-wise. And I mean, this is a very similar situation that the Bengals found themselves in a couple years ago with, they had the decision between Chase and Sewell, and they obviously decided to go with Chase. And I think the Chargers may go with a similar outcome where they say, hey, we can address the offensive line in so many different ways. We need to get playmakers for our QB. We're never going to be in the spot again with the QB that we have. Let's go get the generational guy. Let's go get Bowers.
Yeah, and I think Bowers or Neighbors are going to make a lot of sense if they are the pick. I mean, looking at the wide receiver room again, we kind of already addressed it, but if in 2 years' time you're looking at the Chargers and Keenan Allen is retired or just way too old to contribute at a high-end level anymore, and Mike Williams is off the roster because he was costing too much, and you're left with a roster that has Quentin Johnston, who maybe hasn't taken that next step, and Josh Palmer, who's kind of capped about what he can produce. He's maybe like a guy who can fill in that wide receiver 3 spot, but he's never really able to elevate into that next level. Then a lot of people are going to be looking back in hindsight and saying, you had the chance to get a Neighbors. You had the chance to pick your favorite wide receiver in this class, even if it was Odunze, and you didn't take advantage of that. So the options on the board are certainly enticing for either position. And again, they could go Bowers as well, to where the offense is kind of more filled out. But even if you bring back Everett, he's a serviceable guy as well. They have the guys that maybe 1 year, 2 years, it's okay if they're the starter, but you're trying to find the long-term piece. And that's where the big question comes up, because you could argue that the wide receiver class is a situation where they take a tackle here and then they can easily get someone that maybe falls to that second round, whether that's Keon Coleman, Adonai Mitchell, Xavier Worthy. Not saying all those guys are going to get to the second round, but one of them, maybe 2 or 3, could potentially fall where you're saying, okay, we feel pretty good about the fact that we now have a long-term tackle that is starting for our team and we think fits our identity. And then we now have a weapon that we feel good about going into the future, even if guys like Mike Williams and Keenan Allen are no longer part of the team in 2-3 years' time.
Yeah, I mean, you know me, I'm not a huge Mike Williams guy, and Keenan Allen is getting up there. I really feel like it depends on how much confidence this new staff has in Quentin Johnston, who had a very, very rough rookie year. But, he's a guy who I love as a prospect. I definitely think that he will, develop into a productive and a really good starting wide receiver. But yeah, you really have to plan and kind of say, where do we see ourselves in 2-3 years? Who's realistically going to be on this roster? But it really comes down to, do the Chargers kind of think they need a mini rebuild or retool where you kind of have to move out some of your larger contracts, bring in some young guys? Or do you say, our roster is really good right now, it's kind of a ticking time bomb with the older guys that we have on the roster, let's go get the instant impact player now?
Yeah, and that's one of the more interesting situations, because you have an elite quarterback that you feel, if you have the QB in place, you're able to retool any offseason. That's how most franchises or front offices kind of look about these things. But when you have Herbert, who has been the quarterback, and, Telesco made some big signings that when they were made, people were excited about them. J.C. Jackson was obviously expected to be this huge cornerback presence in the secondary. Khalil Mack was expected to be one of the best edge pairings with Joey Bosa. And, they were pretty good, but injuries really consistently hindered this team, and this organization as a whole is now looking at is Herbert going to be this guy that just automatically makes us able to turn into a contender any offseason? Or do we need to make this a 1 to 2 year approach, or maybe be more patient and try to get the more developmental guys and start moving off of our big contracts? Because if they're just going all in and they're saying we think we are good enough when healthy to contend, you're probably not moving on from Mike Williams, and you're probably bringing him back next year because you know he has the chemistry with Herbert and you know what he's able to do when healthy. But at the same time, are you able to kind of overcome what is the competition of the AFC, especially AFC West, when you're in a division rivalry that has been rather one-sided with the Kansas City Chiefs?
Yeah, I mean, if you take someone like Alt, which is, I think, in my opinion, a pretty, win-now move, what is the realistic ceiling for this team? If you just kind of run back the same team, let's hope Mike Williams bounces back, and let's hope Keenan Allen can stay healthy. Let's hope somehow we can retool find a new center, retool the secondary. Let's go out and win. What's the realistic ceiling? Are you happy with kind of a championship game loss, which I think is kind of the hard ceiling of this team? More realistically, it's like a wild card loss or a divisional series loss, and then you're back here next year asking yourselves the same questions. Everybody's a year older, and I don't know if the Chargers are really happy with that. I kind of think that Harbaugh is kind of want to rebuild this team into his vision, what he wants out of his football team, which is going to look a lot like what the Michigan team looked like. So in my opinion, I think they go with Bowers. I think they go with the generational guy that you say, hey, in a year from now, at least we know we have this building block for Herbert that we can kind of build around him, and we'll let everything else fall as it may.
So if you're picking a number 5, you're taking Bowers, is what you're saying?
If I'm the Chargers, I'm taking Bowers. I mean, it's too elite of a talent, and you're never going to be here again. You're never going to pick top 5 as long as Herbert's your QB and healthy, ideally. Who knows? Herbert can get injured again, and you're picking again in the top 5, top 10, but ideally, you take Bowers. You're not picking here again. You continue to rebuild, retool, move off some of the older guys, bring in young guys, and Bowers is that cornerstone prospect. I do think of him that highly, that you could really build an offense around him and Herbert.
Yeah, I think if I were to predict right now, I would also go with Bowers. I do think that any of the tackles make a lot of sense, to where if someone continues to kind of move up the board and we start hearing the Chargers are very interested, I would believe it. But I do think with the familiarity that they already have with Mark Andrews, Bowers just makes the most sense to me. And it's something that I think is both a good move for the long term and for the immediate term with this team, which I think you kind of have to keep one foot on both sides. I know a lot of times it's better to be vindictive and kind of go all in on either you're going for the rebuild or you're trying to contend. But I think there's a little bit of appeal with a guy like Bowers, who is such a great weapon. Now, if they have the option to trade down, do you think that's something that is... Do you think they should do that? Do you think they should maybe move down to number 10 for the Jets if they're all in on trying to get a tackle around Aaron Rodgers? Or do you think this is something where, you just got to stick at 5 and take the guy that you love most?
I mean, it's really how far away you think this Chargers roster is. And I'm not really sold on this Chargers roster. I think even when fully healthy, it's not a real contending team. A drop-off from 5 to 10, I mean, what's that going to get you? A second, a third? I do think it's a trade you have to make. And at 10, there's still a lot of good wide receiver, offensive line talent who could be there. Hell, Bowers might even still be there at 10 as well. So I do think if a team's looking to trade up and you don't fall back too far, you still pick in the top 10, 11, 12, I think that it is a trade back that you kind of have to do if you're the Chargers looking at the state of their roster.
Well, there you have it, folks. This is the first episode of the 2-Minute Drill podcast show. Hopefully you guys liked it. We're still very inexperienced, so we're going to try to iron out some stuff. But overall, we liked it. We hope you guys liked it as well. And we will see you guys tomorrow when we talk about Brock Bowers and where he could potentially land.